Is this Christianity really anything to do with Jesus Christ? Or is this Christianity simply a spiritual justification for white supremacy? And I believe it's the latter. I believe that the Christianity that most individuals practice within the global South and within marginalized communities in the global North is the Christianity of the colonizer, which justifies white supremacy. So when I talk about decolonizing Christianity, what I'm trying to do is show how this faith tradition that many have adopted and embraced contributes to their own oppression.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Great, we're on now, so I'm gonna start talking. Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on Conversations with Pastor Cliff. And today I have a wonderful guest, and his name is Professor Miguel De La Torre. And he's a social ethic, and he's also a scholar activist. And he's written a number of books. Some of the books that he has written go by the name of Resisting Apartheid, America, Decolonizing Christianity, Bearing White Privilege, and Reading the Bible from the Margins. Professor Miguel, welcome to Puluso Ministries on Conversations with Pastor Cliff.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. I know you and I are going to have an awesome conversation about these books that you have, penned down. But before we jump right into our conversation, I'd like you to, introduce yourself to our audience as to who you are and what has kept you going until this day.
Okay. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a social ethicist. I teach at the Ida School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. And basically, the interest of my research has always been the intersection of religion with race, class, gender, and sexuality, especially how religion impacts and contributes to the oppression of individuals. So that has been really the focus of my work. I've been doing this been a professor now for about 20 plus years. Written about 45 books, if I'm not mistaken. So very active in the academy.
Fantastic. You've certainly contributed a lot in the academy. And one of the books that I've mentioned that are very striking to me, I've gone through them, and I would like us to probably zone in on those books because I really found them to be quite profound in what you bring out in those books, particularly in the area of activism, in the area of decolonization. Perhaps if we can talk about decolonization of Christianity, you seem to show that there's an intersection between Christianity. And so, what I want to ask you is what has inspired you to actually write that book and some of the key insights that you bring out from that book specifically?
Well, the whole purpose of colonialization was to civilize and Christianize the natives, the savages, the primitive people. So the idea of civilizing, obviously learning Eurocentric ways of government, and Christianizing, learning a Eurocentric religious worldview, really go hand in hand. You really cannot separate them. So the question that I've been wrestling with is this Christianity that we practice, and by we, I'm talking those of us who come from the global South. Is this Christianity really anything to do with Jesus Christ? Or is this Christianity simply a spiritual justification for white supremacy? And I believe it's the latter. I believe that the Christianity that most individuals practice within the global South and within marginalized communities in the global North is the Christianity of the colonizer, which justifies white supremacy. So when I talk about decolonizing Christianity, what I'm trying to do is show how this faith tradition that many have adopted and embraced contributes to their own oppression.
Okay, that sounds very interesting, Professor Miguel. Um, but now, there seems like there's an intersection between this colonialism, as you mentioned it, and how Christian theology itself may have been constructed and have been pretty much handed down to us over time. And what effect does that have, to modern day readers or modern day religious people and communities in general?
Yeah. I think the major problem is for those individuals who embrace Christianity from the global south and from minoritized communities within the global north, that Christianity that they're embracing really reinforces their oppression by imposing upon them a very Eurocentric worldview. Prior to the civilizing and Christianizing of the native, there was a worldview that existed among those who would end up being colonized. And that worldview, um, really was effective and important to those of the global South. But what this Christianity from Europe did was replace how we see the world and how we see God with a Eurocentric view that justifies and supports colonialism and white supremacy. So, even by embracing the Christianity of Europeans, we are really contributing. We are really our own oppressors, our own disciplinarians. And I'm trying to break that bond by trying to understand this faith through our own culture and through our own ethos, which is different from the European one. So the whole decolonizing process is eliminating the European culture that has been embedded in the Christianity that the missionaries have told us about.
Wow, that sounds quite profound. And I know in your book, Bearing White Privilege, and the title itself is very provocative. So tell me, what is the central idea of this book, and how does that impact your, Christian communities today, and how should they view this, your title specifically on, bearing this white privilege?
Yeah.
What exactly are you trying to get at?
Well, I wrote that book when Donald Trump became president. And what surprised me is that an individual who has said racist things, who has said sexist things, who have said xenophobic things, was embraced and supported by white Christians. And not just white evangelical Christians, but a majority of white mainline Christians, white Catholics, white Protestants. So I was trying to figure out how can those who call themselves Christian support an individual who has throughout his entire life done tremendously unchristian things. And the only thing that I could see in this rise of Christian nationalism is that Christianity had little to do with faith or religion and had more to do with supporting the colonizers' vision of white supremacy. So to bury white privilege is to bury the whiteness and the Eurocentrism of Christianity.
Wow, I'm very intrigued by this title, white privilege, and to bury it, of course, as you mentioned in your book. But now we tend to find that many institutions that are Christian tend to have these white privilege that are dominant within those institutions. Do you perhaps have some practical steps how that white privilege could be dismantled?
Yeah. Well, I give you an example. And I know you're in Africa, so this might be a good example. Many of the missionaries who brought their Christianity to Africa also brought their bias against individuals um, who were gay, who were queer. So that now many of the Christians, not many, but there's large groups of Christians in Africa who are very anti-gay, while many of the Christians who are the descendants of the missionaries have moved away from that. So now you have this very weird situation in where those who were missionized are more faithful to the theology of the missionaries than the descendants of those missionaries. And I think this is what I'm talking about, this white Eurocentric privilege that has infested Christianity. And how does one dismantle that? It's almost impossible because it is intertwined with one's own ethos, with one's own worldview. So the question that I think I know myself as a Latin American constantly am wrestling with, and I would assume Africans are also wrestling with, as Asians should be, is what is the views of my culture before the colonizers came, and how do I understand Christianity through the symbols of my culture? And when I do that, some of the biases, or maybe not some, but most of the biases, and most of that worldview that is detrimental and oppressive are seen for what it is. And that spiritual justification of that oppression hopefully can be challenged.
Fantastic. What I'm getting from you, Miguel, is that what you're actually challenging is not necessarily Christianity, but Eurocentric Christianity that has manifested itself. And I know in your book, Resisting Apartheid, America, you draw a lot of parallels between the U.S. and South Africa with the apartheid system in America, and you show that groups were typically marginalized, and you have systems of oppression within those societies. And I want us to probably share what some of your findings were when you drew these parallels in these two different contexts in the U.S. and South
Right.
Africa.
Well, definitely, I think we need to begin by recognizing that apartheid, as a philosophy, rooted in white supremacy, is very much alive in the world. I'm not quite sure, and I'm not an expert on South Africa, but it seems to me that you still have some apartheid, the residues of apartheid. We definitely see it in Palestine. And
Correct.
in the United States, we see it really growing. We see it really becoming a return to the former apartheid system, which we used to call Jim Crow. So we see that happening. And Jim Crow for the United States, which is really apartheid, is occurring as we restrict the voting rights of minoritized communities, as we make it harder for people of color in the United States to vote. We see it as our voices are being banned from our educational system, where I cannot teach my Latino worldview because it will be seen as hostile and therefore racist and therefore banned from the schools. Some of the books that I've written cannot be used in classrooms in my country, which is supposed to be a democracy where free expression exists. So we are developing, not developing, I take that back. We are redeveloping an apartheid system that even though we may elect a liberal Democrat, the damage of Trumpism still exists with us. And not that Trump began this, Trump just accelerated the internal oppression within the United States. And that's what I'm trying to deal with. That I see this country, the United States, moving towards this apartheid system. I see the spirit of apartheid spreading through the world. I see many other countries following the lead of the United States, and that deeply concerns me.
And tell me, Professor Miguel, in your answer, do you perhaps have some examples of how other communities that were, oppressed, particularly from the U.S. context, would have resisted this, apartheid that you are mentioning, and how they pushed back against some of these status quo and these hegemonic powers that are at play here?
Yeah, and here's where I'm somewhat a little hopeless. Many of the communities of color within the United States have embraced the Eurocentric worldviews that have given rise to white nationalism. I am distressed at how many minoritized communities are increasing their support for someone like a Donald Trump. So our own minds are so colonized that we are beginning to see the coming apartheid structures as something good for the nation. So when I wrote specifically the book Decolonizing Christianity, I make it clear I wasn't writing that book for my white colleagues. I was writing it for other communities of color whose minds have been so colonized that they are becoming the defenders of this white Christian nationalism. Zoe Huston once said, "Not all skin folk are kinfolk." Just because a person has dark skin does not mean that they are necessarily an agent for liberation. Unfortunately, our minds could become so colonized that we become the instrument of white supremacy to maintain their hegemonic power.
That's so key what you bring out, Miguel, because as you know, in democratic South Africa today, we have a predominantly a black government, but we find that most of them today are kind of anti-black. So
Mhm.
but they're black bodies, so that
Right.
could be perpetuating uh, white privilege and white supremacy. And in your view, because it segs into the next question that I want to ask you, is that we know we have political freedom in this country, but economic freedom in South Africa is not something that is a reality, and we still have remnants of what we inherited from apartheid, South Africa specifically. And tell me, what is the intersection of economics in the social space with race and oppression in your own view and understanding?
Yeah. No, and that's a good question. I mean, what do you do when dark bodies have white voices and become the defenders of apartheid and become the defenders of white supremacy? And that's a problem I think that many communities throughout the world are facing. How do we decolonize our own minds? But to the question of economics and political freedom in the United States, with the civil rights movement of the 1960s was not just voting rights, that was important. It was also economic rights. There was a movement to create a more economically just structure. But what happened was that the movement was co opted, specifically by white liberals, in where they defined civil rights as voting rights. And when voting rights occurred, then we can say we've achieved equality, we've achieved the goals of the civil rights, our job is done.
Mhm.
When it obviously was not, because the economic structures were not changed. And what occurs is you can vote, but if you don't have that economic power, your vote ends up being bought by those who do have that economic power. And if not bought, suppressed, as we are seeing now, in where you have majority districts that are of color, Black or Latino or Asian, but are gerrymandered. The lines of the district are drawn in such a way that they have no political power. And the reason that could occur is because of the economic power that the few do have. So you cannot have political freedom if you do not have economic equality. And I think that's the mistake that was made during the civil rights movement, that that the struggle for economic justice seemed to have been abandoned. And I think that's the mistake that South Africa also made in the collapse of apartheid, that the focus was on the political freedom, which is important, but what remained in place was the economic structures that continued to advance a disparity in income.
That's so key, Dr. Miguel. You mentioned that you cannot have political freedom without economic freedom. Now, I want to ask you, if we segue into a religious space, you have penned a book, reading the Bible from the margins, and what I essentially want to ask you, because it's an important work in the biblical um, studies field, and can you explain, the impact of reading the Bible from the margins, and how does that impact on one's interpretation of the Bible as they engage this biblical text, as they, because we exist as religious communities. I would like to believe in a political arena and also an economic arena.
Hmm. It's interesting because the book Reading the Bible from the Margins, I think I wrote over 20 years ago. It was one of the first books I've ever published, and interesting enough, it became one of my best known books that I've ever written. And yet, there's some stuff, some things in the book that maybe today I don't necessarily agree with, because hopefully scholars do evolve and they do, begin to have new ideas that impact their worldview. But the one thing that I tried to do in that book, which I still strongly believe is true today, is to try to read the book from the perspective of those who are suffering, from the perspective of those who are oppressed, whether the oppression be economic oppression or racial oppression or ethnic oppression, gender oppression, orientation oppression. So the whole book was an attempt to read other works by marginalized and disenfranchised communities to understand how they read the Bible.
Mhm,
Because the way that the oppressed read the Bible is very different than the way that their oppressors read the Bible.
mhm.
And unfortunately, in our theological schools, we have been taught to read the Bible through the eyes of the colonizer, through the eyes of the white supremacist, through the eyes of the oppressor. And we have internalized those interpretations. So what I was trying to do in that book early in my career is move away from those Eurocentric interpretations and try to read the Bible through the eyes and understand it through the eyes of marginalized communities.
Now, you raised something quite interesting, that people who read these texts, and the Bible specifically, would be reading it from what was handed down to them from you know white theologians, if you were to put it that way.
Mhm.
And tell me now, Dr. Miguel, this approach is very different to what a lot of people are accustomed to. And what would be some of the challenges that one could encounter when they engage in reading the Bible from the margins? And also, how do they navigate, and what challenges could you perhaps bump into?
Yeah. Well, it depends on who's reading the Bible. I mean, if it's the dominant culture that's reading the Bible and trying to read it from the margin, it could be very convicting. They could begin to see that they may never have really been Christians. I mean, it could be life challenging because all of a sudden the entire worldview which is based on white supremacy, is challenged by those who read the Bible from a different ethos and culture. So for them, for the dominant culture, it becomes a rebuke of their faith. It becomes a rebuke of how they have interpreted the biblical text and has taken it for granted and just assume it's true. Secondly, I think, all too often, there is this naivete that somehow the way I read the Bible as a colonizer is not an interpretation, but God's actual word. That the way I interpret the Bible is God's truth. And there is this fusing and confusing of the word of the deity with the word of the colonizer. And what reading the Bible from the margin does is that it challenges that merger of these two very different things. And hence, those interpretations that support white supremacy, that support colonization, are shown that they are false interpretations. Now, for the colonizer, for the colonized, for those who have learned to read the Bible through the eyes of their oppressors, I think reading the Bible with new eyes, reading the Bible through one's own cultural symbols and one's own cultural ethos is extremely liberating, because all of a sudden they find themselves in the stories of the Bible. They are no longer reading the Bible through the interpretation of those who want to maintain the status quo. They're reading the Bible as a revolutionary text that calls for radical praxis. And I think that that's extremely liberating, and it makes the Bible very real. That, in the United States, during slavery, the slave master would always hire a preacher to preach to his slaves. And what the preacher would preach would be like Ephesians, slaves obey your masters. But instead, what the enslaved were taking from the Bible is the story of Moses leading the enslaved toward freedom and liberation. So you have two radical ways of interpreting the biblical text: one that reinforces oppression, and one that calls for liberation.
I know the biblical text is quite diverse itself, and many readers who engage with it may not necessarily be aware, rightly or wrongly so, that they're dealing with diverse times and context in the Bible itself. And now, how would one then equip themselves with these learning how to read the Bible and diversify their perspective of engaging with the biblical record?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The biblical text is very diverse. It was written by many different individuals over many different periods of time, and at times it's very contradictory. But I mentioned Moses leading God's people towards liberation and towards a promised land. But what we many times ignore is that there were people living on that promised land, the Canaanites, who were the indigenous people, and they were eradicated. Their lands were stolen from them, and they became oppressed. So the ones who were once oppressed now become the new oppressors, through God's promise of this land that belonged to someone else. The danger is in the United States that Europeans read that and it justified their conquest of the indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere, and it justified their genocide specifically the book of Joshua, that calls for genocide of the Canaanites. The same thing happened in South Africa, in where the story of Moses leading God's people to the promised land was oppressive to the indigenous people of South Africa and all of Africa as well. And we see the same thing happening in Palestine today. So to read the Bible from the margins is to read the Bible from the perspective of the Canaanites, which are today's Indians in the Western Hemisphere, Black South Africans in South Africa, or Palestinian in the so-called Holy Land.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
Okay, that's so profound, Professor Miguel. But now tell me, people will be reading this text and they'll be saying, they are gleaning the truth from it, But now, what is the closest reading of getting to the truest understanding of what people are engaging with in the text, or is there such a thing as true in your own opinion?
I think Isaiah says, "My ways are above your ways, as the sky is above the ground." I think anyone who reads the Bible and has determined what the truth is a tremendous degree of hubris, because if anything, when you read a sacred text, no matter what the sacred text is, it's sacred because it is something that you struggle with. It is not something that you automatically know what it says, or So so how do I not so much know what is the truth, but how do I come close to what the overall message of the biblical text is? And in that book, Reading the Bible from the Margin, I point to John 10:10, for I have come to give life and give life abundantly. So whenever I read a text and I interpret it in such a way that does not provide abundant life, then that interpretation must be wrong. So if I read the story of Joshua that calls for genocide, obviously that's not going to bring abundant life to the Canaanites. So the interpretation of duplicating Joshua in the Western Hemisphere, in South Africa, in Palestine is a wrong interpretation. It is not the truth. To read wives obey your husband, or slaves obey your master, that does not provide abundant life for either women in one sense or the enslaved in another. So to use that text and interpret it in such a way to justify patriarchy and a hegemonic racism is a wrong interpretation. No matter what I say, that no matter what the Bible says. So to read the Bible from the margins requires a wrestling with the text, in where at some points you have to say, this text is wrong, it's problematic. The psalmist in I think it's Psalm 139 that says, I will take the babies of my enemies and dash their heads against the rocks. I would hate to think anyone reads that and decides to implement it as the biblical truth.
I like what you are bringing out, because many people are socialized into different societies, and what they would tend to do is to read their socialized construct into the biblical corpus, and we find this in a lot of commentaries, in a lot of preaching, when people are preaching what they deem as truth from the Bible. But now what I want to establish is who gets to write commentaries. We have hundreds of commentaries
Yeah.
on perhaps Matthew alone, and other books of the Bible. Who gets to write these commentaries?
Oh, absolutely. I do, because I'm a professor of religion, and I have written commentaries. And there's a danger in that, because my social location is very different. I read into the Bible my very social location. And because I am a professor who has a stable job and has an income that has created middle class privilege, I interpret the biblical text through that middle class privilege.
Mhm.
No longer am I interpreting the text from the perspective of the poor, the people who don't have money, where an income and a job is not necessarily a given. So when you read a commentary, you are reading the privileged location of the writer of that commentary. Unless, and this is what at least I try to do, I bring in the voices of those who are not part of my ethos and my social location. And unless in the writing I am very cognizant of how my social location biases my interpretations. But all too often, what happens is that we read these commentaries and we assume that the commentary is inerrant and God's actual word, when it's nothing more and nothing less than an interpretation, and should be taken as that, just an interpretation. So the way to correct this, I think, is to read the commentaries of people who are minoritized. In other words, when I read commentaries, I look for commentaries written by African American, written by Asians, written by women, written by feminists, written by queer folk, written by people from other countries who are colonized, and written by people who are not Christians. Because in this vast amount of reading, it begins to challenge my social location's interpretations of the text.
And Professor Miguel, tell me, there's a lot of people today who, there's this strong urgency to going back to, this old time religion or the ancient text, or how Christianity was, say, perhaps in the time of Jesus, but we know there was no Christianity in the time of Jesus anyway. So now, what is the importance and significance of someone, embracing to learn to diversify their interpretation of the Bible, and learning from other people who are not particularly from privileged positions in the
Mhm.
social structure, because that's something quite challenging to do. But it's also, there's also benefit in doing that. And can we also, uh, engage in theology without contextualizing it to a point?
Yeah, well, you're right. There was a movement of going back to the original text, going back to how the Bible was interpreted by the first Christian community. There's just a major problem with that. We don't live in that world. That world does not exist. We are not an agricultural. We do not live in a world where nation states exist. That world does not exist. And they interpreted the text for their world and their time. And to try to impose their praxis on today's world and today's time would just do tremendous damage. Their world at the time, operated under an empire. Their world at the time was highly patriarchal. Their world at the time was highly agricultural. That's not our world today.
Mhm.
The Bible, the sacred text, any sacred text, must always be reinterpreted for the times in which we live in.
Mhm.
How we read the biblical text 100 years ago is different than how we read the text today.
Mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay, because if the text cannot change with the times and have a message for the new era in which we live, then that text is really worthless. So, the beauty of the biblical text is that I believe it has a message for us today, a
Mhm.
message that may be different than it did when it was first voiced. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that the text was, how the text was understood 2,000 years ago, must be discarded. I mean, I think the message of taking care of the poor, the message of the option for the poor, the message of love and love abundantly, I think those messages are timeless.
Mhm.
But other interpretations that are rooted in a social context that is 2,000 years ago simply do not work in our 21st century. So, how do I today wrestle with the text? Um, paying attention to some of its eternal messages of love, but at the same time, not implementing some of the very specific issues that dealt with their particular social location and period of time.
Great. But it's important that you bring that out, Professor Miguel, because what I'm hearing you say is that theology is contextual, and
Yes.
uh, and one cannot do universal theology because your interpretation of scripture would be deemed for that particular time in which you are, engaging in interpretation for your context. Therefore,
Mhm.
what I'm hearing you say, if I'm correct, is that each generation is tasked to actually interpret the Bible for themselves in their time. So therefore, gospel message for them would obviously change from generation to generation, and you cannot have one answer because the questions and answers will never be the same.
Right. And not just from generation to generation, even within this present generation, from location to location. As a Black South African, when you read the Bible, you read it very differently than a Latino living in the heart of the empire. We will read different verses that are more important to us. We would read different stories that we would interpret differently. And that doesn't mean that one of us is right and the other one is wrong. It just means that because of our social location, we are seeing things in the biblical text that the other does not see. And because we're both male, what would happen if a woman was to read the Bible in Asia? Her interpretations, what she sees in the biblical text, will be radically different than what you or I see. So the issue is, how do we learn from each other what the biblical text has to say for our times, realizing that your interpretation, the interpretation of the woman in Asia, or my interpretation, is not the right interpretation or the wrong interpretation. It's just a different interpretation for a different context.
I like that. I like that because what I'm hearing you say is that we're coming up with these multiple voices that we can pretty much learn from one another, and all these interpretations are kind of helpful to actually see things from a different angle. And now what I want to pin in is what is the significance there then in reading scripture in community, because you tend to find a lot of people belong to different denominations, and they would say we have the right interpretation, whatever that means. But why is it important for people to actually read scripture in community and the benefits thereof?
Yeah. I think, and there's an important point. Eurocentric interpretations of the Bible have made their subjective interpretation objective for everyone else. All of our interpretation are subjected to our time and to our location. But what Eurocentric Christianity has done is make their interpretation objective for everyone. So they have the truth, and we just have interesting interpretations. When in fact, Eurocentric reading of the Bible is just as objective, I'm sorry, just as subjective as our interpretations, tied to a specific time and a specific social location. So, if I truly want to understand what the biblical text has to say for my generation, I have to hear your voice. I have to hear the voice of the woman in Asia. I have to hear the voice of the queer person reading the Bible. And I have to hear the voice of the Eurocentric reader. I don't have to hear the voice because I know that voice already. I've been trained in Eurocentric biblical studies all my life. But the point is, by listening to all these voices in community, I begin to get a better understanding of the message of the biblical text. And while I don't have the hubris to say that that interpretation is the true interpretation, I can say that it is closer to whatever truth might be. Now, the practicality is more than likely when I read the Bible, I'm reading it within my community. And therefore, I may not be able to hear the South African voice or the Asian voice only because of my location and where I'm rooted. And the way I need to solve that dilemma is that when I'm in my own community, as a community, we have to read the writings that are coming out of Africa. We have to read the writings that are coming out of Asia. Because if we don't read those writings, then we remain ignorant of what the Bible has to say.
I like that. I like that very much because it's actually encouraging us to, to embrace other perspectives and to learn from one another, essentially. But what I want to get at, I mean, you've published a lot of books, more than 40, 45 books, and still counting, I hope. What I want to ask is, how do your books, specifically to these books we are talking about today, plug into the broader conversation on social justice, equality, in the religious space and also in the social space, specifically.
Yeah, it's interesting as a scholar, as a writer, when I write a book and I set it free into the world, you never know if anybody's going to even read it. You just don't know because very few people ever call you up and say, "Hey, I read your book and this is what I thought." So it's kind of like out there, but it's like you don't you're disconnected from it. It's hard for me to even imagine if my works have had any impact anywhere. I would hope that they have, but I simply do not know. But what I hope is occurring is that because I am a social ethicist, I don't write for the ages. I write for the right now. My writing deals with what's occurring now. So once it's published, it quickly becomes obsolete because time moves on, social context changes, and what I wrote about was for the social context of the present, not imagining what the future is going to be. And I don't have the a crystal ball that I could write to the context of the future. So what I'm hoping is that when I publish a book, and this is probably why I'm writing so many, is that it has something to say about the now. And if it does, I'm hoping it might spur some individuals to take action.
Mhm. And tell me, Professor Miguel, I know, with this publication of you know your books and your work, and scholarly work, of course, is always evolving, and it has to be placed within time, and time is not waiting for anybody. We got to
Mhm.
catch on with time. And tell me, in your assessment as you go, you have mentioned elsewhere that you are hopeless, but you are trying not to, slipping into despair. And I want to, ask you, how do you maintain that balance of not,
Mhm.
getting into despair in this world that is full of social injustice and also evils that you can identify in high places.
Yeah, and you're referring to a book I will call Embracing Hopelessness,
Yeah.
in where I argue that to embrace the hopelessness of the situation, especially what's going on in the world, is very liberating. It's liberating because it no longer depends on me to fix the world. I think all too often when we have hope, we hope that we can bring about a better world. I have come to the conclusion we will not. I come to the conclusion that the hatred that spurs racism and ethnic discrimination and homophobia and sexism, that hatred is going to continue way into the future. So by embracing hopelessness, number one, I'm not the one that has to fix the world. All I have to do is be faithful to the struggle for justice. And number two, once I realize that my actions towards justice are not going to win, oppression and repression will continue regardless of what I do. I realize then that my actions are not because I'm going to win, and they're not because I'm going to get an extra ruby in my crown when I get to heaven. My actions end up defining the faith that I claim to have. And it also defines my very humanity. And that, in and of itself, is worth the struggle for social justice, cognizant that I may never achieve it. Now, we may move the needle forward a few steps, but all too often, neoliberalism and global white supremacy will push us back. And when it does, I don't fall into despair because that is what's expected.
Wow. That kind of gives me hope in hopelessness, I would say. And tell me, how do you handle and deal with the potential resistance and criticism that people may, who read your work, may find some of the ideas that you present in your book, that may feel that they're making them uncomfortable? And how do you then encourage someone who is reading your work, who is for activism against white supremacy, racism, sexism, all the isms that you talk about in a religious context?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I preach my message of hopelessness, I only talk about it to those who are really already hopeless, to encourage them that it's okay, that they don't have to be hopeful. This idea that if you're a Christian, you have to have hope, I think is part of the Eurocentric Christianity that I'm trying to dismantle. Now, if somebody has hope, I have no intention of taking their hope away. Um, you know, all power to them. Great.
Mhm.
I find that my message of hopelessness resonates with those who are the most oppressed within society, those who are willing to give up. And what I find that what my message does is that it encourages them not to give up because it's not an issue of winning and and winning over oppression. It becomes an issue of defining who you are as a human.
Great. Professor Miguel, I think we are running out of time, but before I let you go, I want to ask you a critical question. In terms of your work going forward, what are your future plans and in your projects in relation to the conversation and ideas that you bring out in your books? In these ideas that are, we have established that they are always evolving. How do you plan to, keep your voice relevant, particularly in the religious space and also in the social space going forward?
Yeah. I think one area that I am moving into, that I am beginning to do research in, is the concept of violence. Um, and I'm not an advocate of violence, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, I'm wondering, is violence ever justified in the form of the self-defense of the oppressed, or in the form of fighting structures that are oppressive? That's a very dangerous question to ask,
Mhm.
because as we have seen, the use of violence many times just encourages more and greater violence. And we're seeing this right now in Palestine. So I'm very careful as I'm beginning to wrestle with this question. Cesar Chavez once said, "I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man trying to be nonviolent."
That's a good one.
And I find myself to be a violent man, a very violent man, who is trying to be nonviolent. And I want to wrestle with, is violence ever justifiable? And I don't know the answer. I wish, I wish I could say yes or no. I don't know. I want to say no, but as a scholar, I haven't gotten there yet. So I am seriously beginning to think about doing a book on Christian violence as a methodology. And again, I approach this with great trepidation, because I know how problematic this conversation is.
Fantastic. Perhaps as a conclusion, do you have an online presence where some of our audience can read your work, and or maybe get access of what you are doing, your current projects and stuff like that? Do you mind sharing that with our audience?
Sure. I do have a website that has all my books on it, as well as the vast majority of all my op-eds. I write 2 op-eds every month that I get published. So every month I'm having 2. I just wrote an op-ed about what's going on in Palestine, because I was just there the day before the hostilities broke. So I just finished writing an op-ed that got published on Monday. So if anyone wants to see my current writings in short form, 750 to 1,000 words op-ed, all of them are there, along with all my books and along with other information about the kind of stuff I'm working on. Also, there's videos that I've of some of the lectures I've given, and it's on the website. It's Deor, so it's Dr. Deor Miguel De La Torre.com, and they could get all the information there. One word, Deor Miguel De La Torre, one word.
Professor Miguel, it's certainly been great. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I certainly hope our viewers and listeners at home have enjoyed the conversation. Until next time, stay blessed and goodbye.
Thank you for having me. I was glad to be here.
Thank you.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.